Does everyone have a sheet? Okay, good morning everybody. Welcome back. It's great to see everyone again. So the title, You're So Vain, or Are You, was supposed to be a play on the song, You're So Vain. And the topic that I want to talk about today is cosmetic surgery, plastic surgery, and we'll see Moshe Feinstein's approach to that. And we'll develop the issues involved in the question in general, and then we'll see Moshe Feinstein's approach to that. So, just as a word of introduction, in the literature about this, about cosmetic surgery and halacha, it is important to distinguish between reconstructive surgery versus cosmetic surgery. Reconstructive surgery being to sort of like correct something that's wrong, versus cosmetic surgery, which is more sort of thought of as to improve something that's fine, not like a medical problem as it is, but something like to improve something. So obviously sometimes where to draw the line between those two things gets a little bit blurry. But we're going to focus today on cosmetic surgery. So the first historical addressing of this topic in Responsa, this wasn't addressed so much historically because they didn't have technology to really do these types of surgeries, hundreds of years ago. But the first addressing of this topic historically was by Lord Rabbi Emanuel Jacobowitz, who was the Lord Rabbi Doctor, who was born in Ireland, and he served as a pulpit rabbi in New York at Fifth Avenue Synagogue, and then eventually he was the chief rabbi of the British Commonwealth, and he was knighted by the Queen. And he is kind of known as like the father of the discipline of Jewish medical ethics. And he wrote a book, Jewish Medical Ethics, and he was the first person to sort of address this topic in a responsa type of context.
But what would be the difference between this and makeup? We're talking about cosmetics.
Okay, so in terms of the You're So Vain piece,
Right.
in terms of the title, as being one of the issues involved, so it could be that issue would be involved in makeup also, but we'll see what other issues are involved as far as like halachic issues that might be problematic in cosmetic surgery, and then we'll see why it might be different from makeup.
When I went to the door, I missed the name of who you just gave that whole introduction about.
Lord Rabbi Dr. Emanuel Jacobowitz. So he raised, when he wrote about this topic originally in the 1960s, he raised 4 issues that sort of need to be addressed in considering this question. Is cosmetic surgery okay from a halachic perspective? So number 1 was an issue of, 2 of them are more halachic issues and 2 of them are more philosophic, hashkafic issues. The halachic issues being that there's a prohibition to injure someone else or injure oneself, and we're going to develop that more thoroughly in a few minutes, called chavala, right? Chavala. There's also a prohibition to put yourself in danger, sakana. And then the other 2 issues that he raises are more philosophic issues of sort of like are we like saying that we're better than God, kind of like improving God's work, changing the way that God created someone. And also the issue of vanity, like is this just something that we should be opposed to because it seems vain, and that is more of as far as that comes up as a halachic issue, it could be more of an issue for men than for women, because there's a prohibition for men of wearing women's clothing, beged isha, right, and that's kind of expanded somewhat to include like types of activities that women would do for beautification purposes, like men are not supposed to do. So maybe that issue would be more for men, and that the makeup issue might potentially relate to that for like men putting on makeup, let's say, because kind of that's something that like women do, and that might fall under beged isha, that a man shouldn't like put on makeup. But that was another issue that Rabbi Jacobowitz raised with cosmetic surgery, this vanity issue. So that's where the title came from, but there really are a whole host of issues to address. So Rabbi Jacobowitz concluded that he was against it. He concluded that it's problematic, except in a few cases. He gave a few exceptions where if the operation is medically indicated, like it's necessary for some medical reason, like following an accident, or which maybe would be qualified as reconstructive surgery, not what the not what the medical profession today would call cosmetic. Or he also said it could be an exception for if there's like a serious psychological concern. He also gave the exception of if the correction of the deformity is designed to facilitate like an issue, to help with an issue in marriage, like to facilitate a happy marriage, and we'll see that come up again later also. Or if it will enable a person to play like some sort of constructive role in society, help them earn a decent living. If it's like something that's really extreme, that's actually preventing them from being able to earn a living and participate in society, then you'd be allowed to correct it. So his exceptions are kind of broad in terms of like what qualifies as that, where do you draw the line. So that he's the first person to address this in 1961. And a bit later on, Rav Moshe Feinstein addressed this question also. So I want to explore some of the issues more in depth that relate to this topic, and then we'll look at Rav Moshe's approach, like I said. So I listed 4 issues already: the vanity issue, the are we better than God, are we playing creator issue, the danger, the injuring oneself, and then there's one more issue that Rabbi Jacobowitz doesn't bring up, but it's sort of like, I think, that Tzitz Eliezer, Rabbi Eliezer Walderberg, who's another halachic decisor of the 20th century, that he brings up that I think is kind of like makes sense as a place to start with this discussion. So that first issue is the issue of, that we see in source 1, is what are doctors even allowed to do in the first place? So source 1 is a pasuk in Shemot Parak Kaf in Parshat Mishpatim, and it says, if a person, this is a situation of, the context is like someone injures somebody else, right? But if the person, if he rises again and walks abroad upon his staff, then shall he that smote him be quit. Only he shall pay for the loss of time and shall cause him to be thoroughly healed. So if he didn't really cause any like long-lasting damage, then he's off the hook. The person who did the injuring, he just has to pay compensation for the time that the guy wasn't able to work. At the end of that pasuk it says, "V'rapo yirapeh," he shall be thoroughly healed. The person who was injured shall be thoroughly healed. So the context there is that just the person healed, like he got better, the injuries didn't cause him long-lasting damage. But the Gemara picks up on that language and derives from that pasuk, from those words in the pasuk, "V'rapo yirapeh," in source number 2. That this pasuk is actually where the Torah gives permission to doctors to be doctors, to heal people. So why do we need permission for doctors to heal people? Why might we think doctors don't have permission to heal people? Why might we think that a firm Jewish person isn't allowed to be a doctor? That there's something wrong with that. Okay, so one reason maybe if not for this pasuk, this explicit permissions for doctors to heal, maybe we would have thought, well, we can't get involved. Like whatever God wants to happen, it's going to happen, and that's it. We can't get involved. So that's one explanation that Rashi gives. Baruch Shekivant, Joy. Then source number 3, Rashi says on that Gemara, what does that mean? We don't say God is in charge, God decides who lives and who dies, and we can't intervene. Right? Rashi says the reason that we need the Torah to give us permission is because otherwise we would have thought that we're not allowed to get involved because that's interfering with God's will, God's work. But no, the Torah tells us, you're allowed to get involved, you're allowed to intervene, we're allowed to be doctors, we're allowed to try to help people. Does everyone have a sheet? Just came in. Okay, great. So that's one explanation of why we need permission for doctors to heal. Another explanation, which is going to tie back into our question about cosmetic surgery.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah, please.
Do they discern between rishus and chovah on this? You're allowed to, but must you?
That's an interesting question. I don't know. I mean, the Gemara clearly uses the term rishus, so that's interesting. I could imagine arguing, saying like once we have the rishus, then we actually have the chovah, because like we value life and we want everything, right? And we have all these other places in the Torah, the chai b'hem, and we violate mitzvot even to save lives. So maybe if you have the opportunity to save a life, and the truth is I shouldn't say that. There are other sources that talk about like lo tano l'adam re'echa and v'hashevo tolo, and places in the Gemara and Sanhedrin that talk about like you can't stand by and let someone else die or let someone else be injured. So if you're a doctor and you have the ability to help them, then I think you would be obligated to. Maybe not from this pasuk of V'rapo Yirapeh, but from other psukim that talk about that. Okay, so another possible explanation, though, is what we might think if we didn't have this pasuk of V'rapo Yirapeh, is that there's another isser in the Torah of chavala, right, of injuring someone, causing bodily harm to someone, and that's in source number 4. In Zavarim Perek Chafei, the Torah tells us, Ki yeriv bin anashim, v'nikshu al hamishpat, u'shvatu, v'hitzdigu el tzaddik, v'yashivu el harasha. If there's a fight between two people, they're supposed to come to court, and the judge judges, and the judge should make sure that the person who is right, is judged to be right, and the person who's wrong is judged to be wrong. Right? If the wicked man is supposed to get beaten, right? He's supposed to get malkut, he's supposed to get lashes. Then the judge should make him lie down, and he should be beaten before his face according to the measure of his wickedness. Right? He should get it should be proportional to what he deserves. But then the Torah tells us, "Arba'im yakenu lo yosif." He shouldn't get more than 40 lashes. He shouldn't add more. Pen yosif lahakoto alila lakar abav v'nikla achicha le'necha. You're not allowed to exceed 40 because if you exceed 40, then that's already like going too far. It's causing him to be dishonored before your eyes. So the Torah tells us there, you're not when someone's a criminal, then they could get up to 40 lashes. You're not allowed to do more than that. And we learn from there that when someone's not a criminal, you're not allowed to harm them. You're not allowed to inflict any sort of harm on that person. Right? From the fact that we have a limit on the harm that we're allowed to inflict on a criminal, that teaches us that we're not allowed to inflict any harm on someone who's not a criminal, because we have, rachmana, so to speak, on someone who's a criminal, so you're not allowed to inflict any harm on someone who's not a criminal. And that's where we learn this prohibition of chavala, that you're not allowed to injure someone, you're not allowed to cause bodily harm to someone, to other people, and potentially to yourself either. And we'll see about that in a second. So the question is, right, so going back to the issue of doctors being allowed to heal, without doctors being given explicit permission to heal, we might have thought, well, when doctors heal, right, especially back in the day when the way that the techniques that they have are like bloodletting and things like that, that causes physical injury, that causes bodily harm. And even if it's for the purpose of healing them, we might have thought there's this other prohibition of causing someone bodily harm. You're not allowed to do that. So maybe doctors are not allowed to use the techniques that they have to heal. So the Torah tells us, no, if it's for the purpose of healing, then they are allowed to do it, even if it is causing some sort of like physical injury, some sort of bodily harm in the process. So the bottom line is, as far as this issue goes, doctors are allowed to heal people, and we don't have to rely on miracles, and we don't have to just kind of like let things be whatever God, seems to be doing, like we just leave it alone and we don't intervene. And that's even true when it involves chavala. It's even true when it involves giving a shot or doing surgery or any type of thing that would cause some harm. If it's for the purpose of healing, then it would be allowed. But to tie this back into our question about cosmetic surgery, if cosmetic surgery is not to heal, right, everything's fine how it is, but someone wants some improvement, it's not to heal, then first of all, the doctors have permission to do it, because maybe they don't even have permission to do anything, because their rapé only gives them permission to be doctors when it's for the purpose of healing, but maybe they're not allowed to use any of their techniques when it's not for healing. And number two, maybe it's also an issue of chavala. Even if we say that they're allowed to kind of like use their doctor license, maybe they're not allowed to do this because it's causing bodily harm, it's causing bodily injury. You're doing surgery on someone not for the purpose of healing. Is that allowed? So another question to sort of address in this bigger picture is causing harm to yourself. Although anyone who's having plastic surgery, they're not doing it to themselves, right? The surgeon's going to do it, but maybe them even like electing to go in for that surgery would also violate a prohibition of injuring them or allowing themselves to be injured, and we have to also see if that's problematic. So
is that the issue of shaliach? Like if I don't kill the person, but I send someone to kill the person, why would that be any different than hiring a doctor to do, this chavala, even to improve it?
So yeah, 100%. First of all, like even if you're allowed to harm yourself, if the doctor's not allowed to harm someone and you're asking them to harm you, so then that would be problematic. But also, if you're not allowed to harm yourself, like it's even more problematic, right? On two
whether
fronts.
you do it yourself or you hire someone, we have this concept of shaliach, so it's
right.
It would be the same violation or not,
right?
Depending on
Definitely. I mean, the question of shliach l'dvar avira is a question of who's responsible, actually, right? If I hire someone else, normally we have a concept of shaliach. If I hire you to go and do some mitzvah for me, then I get the credit, or even though you did it. But with avira, if I send you to commit a crime for me, you are responsible, even though I sent you to do it.
Oh, really? Okay.
That's the concept. We have this concept of ein shliach l'dvar avira that, like, you should have known better than to listen to me. So
what if you were hired? Does it matter?
So it might, and there also might be like a requirement in Dena shamayim for me, even if you're punished in court. But But yeah, essentially I think you're right. Like regardless of whether the isser is on you or on doing it yourself or on someone doing it for you, like if it's a problem, then it's gonna be a problem regardless. Okay, so the Mishnah, if we look in source number 5. So source number 5 is a bunch of different pieces from a Gemara in Bava Kama, starting from the Mishnah and Daf Tzadi Amud Bet, going through the Gemara and Daf Tzadi Aleph Amud Bet. So I just kind of like put it all in one source on the sheet, but you'll see a bunch of dots because I just took like some snippets of the Gemara that I want us to see. But these are it's all part of like one bigger discussion, but I obviously didn't give you the whole thing. So the Mishnah in Bava Kama tells us that Rabbi Akiva says, "Hachovel ba'atzmo." I'm in source number 5 on page 1. "Hachovel ba'atzmo afal pi she'eino rishai patur." So if someone injures himself, even though he's not allowed to do that, he's patur, meaning he's exempt from he's exempt from punishment, even though he wasn't allowed to do it. But acherim shechavlu bo chayavim. But if you injure somebody else, then you get punished. Okay, so that's what Rabbi Akiva says in the Mishnah, that if you injure yourself, you don't get punished, but you still weren't allowed to do it. So you're not allowed to injure yourself or other people, according to Rabbi Akiva's view in the Mishnah. But then
it doesn't tell you why he doesn't get punished.
Probably because like we can't derive the Torah, like the way it's derived from the Psukim only allows us to punish someone who is doing it to somebody else, but it's still viewed as like something that you're not supposed to do, but we wouldn't like technically be able to get the punishment because of like the way it's derived from the Psukim. But we'll see in a second that actually if you look at the next piece of the Gemara that I gave you, continuing, right, that's what Rabbi Akiva says in the Mishnah, but then the Gemara says, "V'hatanya amar lo Rabbi Akiva." Doesn't a Breita teach that Rabbi Akiva said, "Tzilalta b'mayim adirim v'ha'elita cheres b'yadecha adam rashai lachvol v'atzmo." Right, quoting a pasuk, "You have dived into the depths and have brought up a potsherd in your hands, for a man may injure himself." That if someone, injures himself, like his hand, with some sort of like pottery thing, that he's allowed to do that. So if we have our Mishnah that said Rabbi Akiva says you can't injure yourself, but then we have this Raita, right, which is another Tanaitic source where Rabbi Akiva seems to be saying you can injure yourself. So it seems to be contradictory statements by Rabbi Akiva, and the Gemara ends up telling us like it's just two different versions of what Rabbi Akiva said. The different students couldn't agree on what he said, and it's two different versions of what he said. And if you look at the next part of the Gemara, right, there are some say that you can't, that you're not allowed to injure yourself, and some say that you can. And then the last piece is that the Gemara brings an example of Rav Chizda, who is an Amora, right, a rabbi from the times of the Gemara, and a story that he's in. Rav Chizda had have a maske b'nei hizimei v'haga. He would walk between thorns and thistles, and he would lift up his pants when he would do that. Madle lehu lamane. Amar zeh ma'ala aruka, v'zeh ma'ala aruka. He would lift up his pants when he did that, and he would obviously hurt his legs. Like his legs would get scratched and cut because he was walking through thorns with his legs exposed. So, but he said, like, my legs are going to heal, the cuts are going to go away. If my pants get torn, like, they're gone, they're useless, I can't use them anymore. So that's what he chose to do. So there are some later authorities that say that from the fact that the Gemara kind of brought Rav Chizda, who's like a later authority's opinion at the end, that was to show that we actually follow that you are allowed to injure yourself. Right? Rav Chizda wouldn't have done that if you weren't allowed to injure yourself, because then he would be violating the Isser of Chavala while he's walking through the thorns. So from the fact that we bring that story towards the end of the Gemara, that shows that we go with a version of Rabbi Akiva who says you're allowed to injure yourself. Okay? So it seems that there is permission, even though you're not allowed to injure other people, maybe you are allowed to injure yourself. In this case of Rav Chizda, it was for some benefit, it was for some purpose of saving his pants and not wanting his pants to get ruined. Okay? So the Rambam, in fact, does rule that way. He rules that you can't wound yourself unless it's for some purpose, right? When it's for some purpose, and it's not in a sort of like degrading way, then you are allowed to. So if you look at source number 6, the Rambam says, Asur la'adam lachbol bin b'atzmo bin b'chaviro, that you're not allowed to injure yourself or someone else. V'lo ha'chovel bilvad ela kol ha'makeh adam kasher miYisrael bin katan bin gadol bin ish bin isha derech nitzayon hareza over below ta'aseh. Shne'emar lo yosif lahakoto. So not only are you not allowed to injure someone in a more deep way, but even striking anyone who's like a good person, whether they're a child or an adult or a man or a woman, derech nitzayon, which means in a sort of like degrading, belligerent type of way. And there's another version of the Rambam that has that word as bizayon, which is, a bizayon is like an embarrassment, right? In a degrading type of way, they violated a prohibition, as the Torah tells us, lo yosif lahakoto, you can't add on to cause further injury to the criminal more than what he deserves. And the Rambam explains in his Hirat Torah shelo lahosif b'hakat hachotei, if the Torah warned us against giving further injury to the person who's a sinner, kal v'chomer lemakat hatzadik, all the more so for you're not allowed to hit someone who's righteous, who didn't do anything wrong. So the main important point to note in the Rambam, though, and to emphasize is this derech nitzayon. Right? The Rambam says you're not allowed to do this only if it's degrading, belligerent, only if it's in a degrading, belligerent way. If it's in a way that's not degrading, if it's in a way that's beneficial to the person, right, that's for some good purpose, then it sounds like you would be allowed to do it. Maybe, right? Maybe you can infer that from the Rambam, and maybe that's based on Rav Chizda in the Gemara. Rav Chizda in the Gemara, he did injure himself, but it wasn't in a degrading way. It was in a way that was beneficial to him, so maybe that's where the Rambam is getting this from, that that's allowed. So it could be that plastic surgery, which is not in a degrading, belligerent type of way, but it's obviously with the consent of the person, and they're signing on, they know what they're doing, they know what they're getting themselves into, they want it, and it's not in a degrading type of way, it's actually for their improvement. Maybe that would be allowed because it is for their benefit and it's not in a degrading way. And we're going to see Rav Moshe Feinstein make that argument. Before we get to Rav Moshe Feinstein, though, I do want to address some of the other issues that come up, which are the more sort of like philosophic issues, and also the issue of, is it dangerous? So we're first going to look at a response, a tshuva from Tzitz Eliezer, from Rav Eliezer Waldenberg, in source number 7 on page 2, where he brings up some of these other issues. So he says...
When did he live?
He lived in the later half of the 20th century. He died a few years ago. I don't remember the exact dates, but I believe that he died in the years that I've been working at my notes, so couldn't be that long ago. So he says, so he's going to talk about nituchim plastiyim. This is also very classic in contemporary responsa to, they're writing in Hebrew, but they use English-sized words. Right, plastiyim is plastic. So nituach is surgery. So he has something to say about plastic surgery. That nowadays all the doctors are doing this to beautify people's bodies, and similar ideas. When there's no sickness, there's no pain, they're just doing it for the purposes of beautifying the person's body. And he says, so he says, first of all, this is not why the Torah gave permission to doctors to heal. It wasn't for this purpose. Right? If you could even call this healing, this doesn't fall under the permission that doctors were given to heal. When the Torah said, it was the doctors were given permission to heal. This maybe is not even healing, and if it is, this isn't what the Torah was talking about. So that's his number one objection. That it's a problem that this is outside the realm of what doctors were given permission to do by the Torah. Number 2, he says, and he also says people can't give doctors permission to injure them for this purpose. And also the doctor himself is not allowed to do it, right? If it's a from doctor we're talking about, then it would be a problem for him to carry it out. Okay, so what's his objection? We're supposed to know and believe that there's no better creator than God. And right, God created every person of his creations with Tzelem Elokim, in the image of God, and with a certain character and personality that matches that person. Right? We're not supposed to add or take away from that. Whatever it is that God gave us, whatever image God created us with, whatever body, whatever personality God created us with, we're not supposed to change that. We're supposed to believe like God is the best creator and his work is beautiful, and we're not supposed to want to fix it. So that's his number 2 concern, is that sort of like philosophic, hashkafic concern that we're like, it's like flying in the face of God to say like we're better, we know better.
Right, but that doesn't, on its own, that holds almost no water, because then if you expand it to, if you have curly hair, you shouldn't straighten it. If
Right.
you were born a little chubby, don't go on a diet, because this is how God made you, or
Right,
vice
100%,
versa.
100%,
So it
right?
only
Like, where
works
do
in
you draw the
hand in hand
line?
with other things.
Right, and I think the Tzitz Eliezer clearly like didn't like this practice, and he's bringing a whole bunch of factors to say why he's against it. But you're right, like in terms of that issue, where do you draw the line? Like,
But isn't it like permanence versus non-permanence? If you're having a nose job, your nose is changed. If you
Right.
put on makeup, your nose is the same nose, but you're beautifying
so
your
you could draw the line that way and say, but in terms of like the philosophic issue involved, like for that day that you're putting on that makeup, like are you saying like I don't like how God made me look, so I'm going to make myself look better? Meaning, even if it's not permanent, like you could, if that's the only argument you're making, like you could still make that argument even on a temporary basis, right?
But isn't it like a chobah that women should dress up? Isn't there sources that women were told to dress up for Yom Tov, their husbands should buy them Kishutim?
Yeah, definitely, 100%.
There's a concept of beauty, so
Yes,
you aggrandize
Definitely.
whatever you were given. So
for
it's-
sure, 100%. There definitely is a concept of of jewelry, of wearing nice clothing. There's a concept that comes up in the sources in Hilchot Nida that talks about like women wearing makeup and how it's actually something that was encouraged. So yes, but the question is like in terms of this philosophic hashkafic issue of flying in the face of like God's will and God's creation, sort of like where do you draw the line with that? Like on the one hand, we do see sources that value and encourage us to make the most of what we're given, and on the other hand, we're saying, but we should
It
just
sounds like
take what
the
we're given.
Amish, if God had wanted us to drive in a car, he would have created cars, but he didn't,
Right.
And, so we've already gone beyond that.
Right. So
of,
So I totally agree that I think this argument alone is not such a strong argument. But he says, but that's one of the arguments that he makes, and then he says, and then in the next paragraph he's going to bring the last argument that he's going to make is v'yotzei miklal zeh chavala l'shem noi v'yofi she'ein ba kol hashava shel avidat haguf, and it comes out of this bodily injury that's for the purpose of decoration and beauty that has no kind of like fixing your body that might have not been working properly. Rather, you're just trying to change what and sort of outsmart the form that God gave you. Or to make yourself look younger. And to contradict the decree of the creator of the king of the world. Right? He's clearly feels very passionately about this. He's speaking in very harsh terms. He says, even if all these other reasons wouldn't apply, you definitely can't put yourself in danger to accomplish these things, right? That and every surgery there's some risk involved, is somewhat dangerous, and he says here it's actually double because you're doing surgery in 2 places, right? They're taking the whatever, obviously non-medical professionals, I'm not an expert in how plastic surgery is done, and it could be it's done differently now from how it was done when he was writing, but he says that you're taking sort of skin from one place and putting it in another place, so you're actually kind of causing injury and injury in 2 places, and the danger is even more. So the Tzitz Eliezer addresses these questions of some of the same questions that Rabbi Dr. Emanuel Jacobowitz addressed, that it's dangerous and that it's hashkafically not appropriate to kind of be messing around with what God gave us, so he addresses those 2 concerns, and also the issue of Rapo Yerapeh, that maybe this is not actually included in the permission that doctors have to be doctors and use the technology at their disposal. So that's one perspective. That's one view of this. Rav Moshe Feinstein, we're going to see, takes a completely opposite approach. So let's go look at that now. In source number 8. So Rav Moshe Feinstein actually doesn't address the philosophic concerns. He really only addresses this issue from the perspective of one of the concerns that was raised, which is the issue of chavala, of causing bodily injury, because that seems to be the main halachic issue really involved here. the philosophic issues, one could argue one way or the other, and even the issue of sakana, of danger, it is kind of, lots of things that we do in life are dangerous, and we still do them, and the understanding from the Gemara seems to be that if something is kind of like a tolerated risk that everybody does, then it's okay, it's allowed, like driving in a car, right? Driving in a car is dangerous, but everybody drives. That's something that's like societally speaking a tolerated risk, and that's something therefore that is allowed, right? You're not violating a prohibition of putting yourself in danger. So the same thing with surgery, right? Like later authorities, there's a tshuva from the Avnei Nezer, who's the Safach Rebbe from early in the 20th century, where he says that he prohibited a boy from getting surgery to kind of correct like a certain deformity, like a crooked leg, because it was dangerous. And later authorities say surgery has developed since then, the techniques that we use, the tools that we use, the way that we do it, it's just less dangerous. Like there are fewer complications. That's not to say it's not dangerous at all, that there are no risks involved, and definitely you have to sign, papers before you go in for surgery, like acknowledging those things. But the danger issue seems to not be as much of an issue, since this is like a tolerated risk in society. If it's something that someone wants to do, then it's something that is done, like people do it. So it seems to not be an issue. So the main halachic issue seems to be the issue of bodily harm, bodily injury, that it really is usher, like you're not allowed to do that, except in certain cases, and we have to see if this falls out, if this could fit as one of those exceptions. So he's asked the question, and his tshuva is from 1964. So it's only a little bit after Rabbi Dr. Emanuel Jacobowitz is writing about this in 1961. He's writing about this in Adar of 1964. So he says, can a young woman, and I'll read in the English, we're on page 3 on source 8 on the bottom. He says, can a young woman beautify herself with plastic surgery that injures her body? And he then goes on to further explain, that's kind of like the heading, and then he goes on to further explain that the specific case he was asked about is, I was asked about a young woman who wants to beautify herself so that people will want to marry her, using what doctors now can do with surgery that is injurious to the body. Is this allowed from the perspective of the prohibition to injure oneself? So he was asked a specific question about a shidduch issue, right? There was a girl, he doesn't say what the specific surgery was that she wanted to, the specific improvement was that she wanted to have, like whether it was a nose job or some other area of her body, he doesn't say. But whatever it was, like this case was a case where the woman felt like she wasn't getting a shidduch because of the issue, and that's why she wanted to do the surgery. And Rav Moshe was asked, is this allowed, or is it a problem of chavala? So he says, he answers the question first based on his inference from the Rambam that we saw in source 6, which I kind of foreshadowed for you what Rav Moshe was going to say. So he says, the Rambam writes in the beginning of chapter 5 of Hilchot Chovel Umazik about the prohibition to strike a good person, that it's when it's in a degrading way. The Rambam said that this prohibition is only when it's derech nitzayon or derech bizayon, only when it's belligerent and degrading. And if so, in this case, Rav Moshe says, right, in the case of the girl who wants to have plastic surgery for the sake of a shidduch, that the injury is for beautification, it's not degrading, so the prohibition wouldn't apply. And he says, if striking one's friend is only a problem when it's degrading, then regarding injuring oneself, it shouldn't be forbidden when it's to beautify, which isn't degrading. So it sounds more repetitive when I translate it into English. It sounded a little bit more graceful in the Hebrew, but he says, essentially, the Rambam says that chavala is only a problem, it's only a prohibition when it's derech nitzayon. If it's not derech nitzayon, if it's for the purposes of beautification, then it's not a problem. It doesn't fall under the rubric of that prohibition, so it should be allowed. And then he brings a bunch of proofs for his interpretation of the Rambam that chavala, for the sake of benefiting someone, for the sake of, when it's not in a degrading way, is allowed. So and there's like different stories from the Gemara and from Tanakh where he tries to prove this from, which is, I think, also very interesting that Rav Moshe is kind of culling, and this goes back to the methodology of Rav Moshe Feinstein, which is what we've been doing here for the past couple of weeks, where he's kind of like culling different examples from different places that weren't necessarily applied to this question in earlier sources, and he's kind of using all of this together to prove, like, look, my interpretation of the Rambam is correct. So he says his first proof is from the Gemara that we saw already of Rav Chizda, right? He says we can bring a proof from the Rambam's opinion, from what the Gemara says in Baba Kama 91a, that Rav Chizda, whenever he had to walk between thorns and thistles, used to lift up his garment, saying that whereas for the body, if it's injured, nature will produce a healing. for garments, if they're torn, nature could bring up no cure, that my body, like the way God created our body, it's going to heal. If I cut myself, the cut's going to heal, God willing. You know, in a healthy person, the blood, you're going to have the clot, and it's going to heal, it's going to scab, it's going to go away. Whereas your clothes are not going to just get fixed if you rip them, right? Maybe you could take them to a seamstress, you could sew them back up, but it's not just going to happen automatically. So Rav Moshe says from this, how would Rav Chisda have done this? He would be violating the prohibition of injuring oneself. If that's something that you're not allowed to do, then how could he decide, I'm going to pull out my pants when I walk through the path? So Rav Moshe says, therefore we must say, we must say that the prohibition of injuring is only when it's degrading. And since Rav Chisda's walk was for a purpose, it's not degrading and it's not prohibited, right? His pulling up his pants was for a purpose, to save his pants. It wasn't in a degrading way, and therefore it's allowed, right? And that's how he proves that the Rambam, when the Rambam said derech nitzayon, he meant only when it's derech nitzayon, only when it's degrading. That's when it's prohibited. That's his proof number one. Proof number two, he says there's another proof from another Gemara in Sanhedrin regarding the story of Micha, who told his peer to strike him. So there's a story in Tanakh, in Sefer Malachim, Aleph, Parak Chaf, I believe? Sefer Malachim, Aleph, Parak Chaf, where Micha gave instructions to someone to strike him, right? It's like if I would say to you, hit me, and you would say, no, right? But why was Micha doing this? Micha was doing this because Hashem told him to. Hashem told him to set up this situation. Why? It was for the purpose of sending a message, right, of getting a point across. The king was supposed to, the king of Bnei Israel at that time, Achav, was supposed to treat somebody in some certain way, an enemy in a certain way as a punishment, and Achav didn't do that. So Micha was supposed to send a message to him saying, this is what really you were supposed to do, right? So that's why he told this person to hit him. And the person refused. And that person who refused to hit Micha was struck by a lion. He was punished. So Rav Moshe learns from there that hitting actually would have been okay in that scenario, right? Striking him, causing him some sort of bodily injury to Micha would have actually been okay in that scenario because it was for a purpose. It was for the purpose of getting a message across to the king who did something wrong. So one could argue against that proof and say, well, that in that scenario was a specific divine command to hit him, so maybe that doesn't necessarily prove to us that in any case of benefit, any case of where there's a purpose for it, it would be allowed if God didn't specifically tell you to do it in that particular case, right? I think you could argue against this proof. But Rav Moshe uses this as another proof to show when it's for a purpose, when it's not in a degrading way, then you're allowed to strike someone, you're allowed to injure someone. That's proof number two. Proof number three, we'll go to the third paragraph on page 4, on the back. Where he says, therefore, it seems from all of this that we should permit a young girl to beautify herself, even if it's through injuring her body, since it's not in a degrading way. Rather, the opposite, it's for her benefit. And then he brings another proof where he says, see Sanhedrin 84b, where Rav Matna says that a son is permitted to do bloodletting on his father because of V'ahavta l'recha kamocha. So normally there's a specific prohibition, right? Makeh aviv v'imo, you're not allowed to strike your parents, you're not allowed to injure your parents. And there's an opinion in the Gemara there that says you can, you could do bloodletting because of V'ahavta l'recha kamocha. And Rashi there says, V'ahavta l'recha kamocha means you're only not allowed to do things to someone else that you wouldn't want done to you. But something that you would want done to you, then you're allowed to do for someone else. So you're only not allowed to do something to your parents that you wouldn't want done to yourself. But if you would want bloodletting done to yourself, and the assumption in the Gemara and in Rashi there is that who wouldn't want bloodletting? Of course, everybody wants bloodletting. That's the way to heal. That's the way to get better, right? Because that was definitely like the understanding of medicine at the time. So you're allowed to do that to your father. And the Shulchan Aruch paskins slightly differently, but the Rambam says if there's no one else to do it, then you are actually allowed to do it. You're allowed to kind of like remove the pain. So Rav Moshe says it's another proof for our case, right? And he says, and if so, I'm in the middle of the third paragraph of the fourth line after the ... He says, and if so, with a young girl who wants to beautify herself for her benefit and according to her wishes, we should easily permit this, even if we don't follow the Rambam in his understanding that Chavala is only okay if it's not degrading, right? Even if you say that Chavala is not okay even if it's not degrading, he's saying this proves that you're even allowed to do it you're still allowed to do it because she would want it. It's for her benefit. So he's kind of adding in another perspective here that even if you say that chavala is prohibited always, that's overruled by her specifically wanting it, right? Even if it's not, even if you have to say like it's somewhat belligerent, it's somewhat degrading, and you would say that that's prohibited, but if she specifically wants it, if it's specifically for her benefit, that kind of adds like another layer of we should definitely permit it then. Because just like the father would want the bloodletting and therefore you're allowed to do it, it proves that if the woman wants this surgery, it's for her benefit and for her pleasure, and she specifically is requesting it, then it would be allowed. So that's his proof number 3. Proof number 4 is another Gemara in Bechorot that's talking, it brings a Mishnah that talks about a firstborn. And this Bechorot is all about firstborns, Bechor. And this firstborn had an extra finger, and the Mishnah says that the firstborn had an extra finger and removed it. And the Mishnah there doesn't mention the fact that Eino Rashai, he wasn't allowed to do this, right? The Mishnah only commenting on the status of this firstborn. Is this considered some sort of blemish? Is it not? The Mishnah doesn't comment on and say, oh, he wasn't allowed to do that. And Rav Moshe picks up on that and says, if it wasn't allowed, the Mishnah would have said, Afal Pisha Eino Rashai, right? Even though it wasn't allowed. So the fact that it doesn't say it wasn't allowed implies it's actually permitted. And he concludes, right, you have to say that since it's for beautification, and therefore for his benefit, since he wants it with the Bechor, there's no prohibition of bodily harm. And he says that this is a proof for our case. So Rav Moshe Feinstein here concludes that cosmetic surgery is permitted because it's not in a belligerent, degrading type of way that you're doing this bodily injury, that you're causing this harm. You can't really call it, I guess you wouldn't even really be able to call it harm. Like obviously surgery hurts and you know, the recovery takes time, but at the end of the day, in the bigger picture, it's not harmful. It's something that the person wants. It's for the person's benefit, and therefore he permits it. And again, like I said before, he doesn't even really address it from the perspective of any of the other issues that were raised in the other poskim. He is very comfortable with it because, you know, that it's not chavala, and it's for the person's benefit, so go for it. What's not clear, though, is how sweeping is his permissiveness meant to be? Is it meant to be like this case, a case of the shidduch issue, like some sort of case of need? Or really if someone just wants to do it for convenience, you know, for really like there's no sort of other great need, would Rav Moshe still allow it then? Yeah.
It seems that it struck me that he never came back to the original situation. He keeps saying for beautification. He doesn't go back, say, for beautification for a
For the
shidduch.
shidduch, right.
He does not,
Right.
he doesn't seem to confine it at all if you
Right.
read it. So I think he frees it from the circumstance.
I agree, and if you look in source number 9, Rabbi Blake, who's a contemporary posek, who is definitely involved in like medical ethics in this book, Judaism and Healing, which has like little short chapters on like different questions of medical ethics. So in here, he talks about cosmetic surgery, and in the footnote at the end, where he quotes Rav Moshe Feinstein, he says, Rav Moshe Feinstein in Rav Moshe Choshe Mishpat 2, number 66, which is the tshuva that we just read, he says, who basing himself upon the terminology employed by the Rambam, which is what we saw in Hilchot Povelu Mazik, unlike the earlier cited authority, so unlike other poskim who are against this, Rav Moshe permits plastic surgery, and Rabbi Blake inserts there, permits plastic surgery even for purely cosmetic purposes. It sounds like Rabbi Blake is interpreting Rav Moshe as like a sweeping heter, like across the board, not a problem at all. Even if it's not in a case of need for, you know, shidduch purposes or getting a better job type of purposes.
This is for men and women.
Rav Moshe is talking about a case of a na'ara, right, a young girl, but he doesn't really address the question of the vanity and the beged isha. He only addresses the question of chavala, so it shouldn't be different for a man, I wouldn't think. Yeah.
I find it difficult, I mean, perhaps because it's a totally separate thing, but like the whole concept of elective surgery to begin with, like going under anesthesia is a dangerous thing, even today. It's not,
Right.
I mean, there are still, unfortunately, the statistics aren't great, but I don't know if that's considered normative danger, like you
Right.
said or not, but I'm surprised that doesn't seem to factor in
Right, he doesn't address
at
that
all.
question.
Like,
Yeah.
does it, having, I don't even know the distinct procedures involved, but like, I don't know if it's general versus local, like,
Right,
and he doesn't distinguish at all.
right. It is interesting that he doesn't bring that up. The truth is, when I was reading the tshuva, I was actually struck by the fact that at the beginning he says, he reports the question asked to him as, is this a problem of chavala? So I was thinking to myself, like, maybe he was only answering that question, like, no,
Right.
it's not a problem of chavala. Maybe he wasn't intending to like take a position on the issue at large, and he didn't like vote. But that's definitely not how contemporary poskim read him. And it also would be weird, like, for him to write a tshuva, like, academically, like, no, it's not an issue of Kabbalah, but, and to not say, like, oh, but I have a problem with it for X, Y, Z reasons. But I was struck by the fact that he phrases it that way, like, is this a problem of Kabbalah, was the question asked to him. But I do think it would be strange for him if he had a problem for it for all these other reasons, especially when all these other, although his tshuva probably was written before the other ones. But I think if you have a problem with it for other reasons, like, he would have said that. But it definitely is striking that he doesn't address those other issues. And the issue of, tolerated risk is obviously subjective, and different people define it in different ways.
But
So-
this is all addressed to the patient, right? It's not an issue of whether the doctor can or cannot.
It's
I mean,
both.
it would be the same.
It would be the same,
applies- it
yeah.
applies to the
If
same.
it's allowed for the patient, it's allowed for the doctor to do it.
But also, I mean, in terms of the doctor's issue, I mean, even the Hippocratic Oath says, the first rule is do no harm. So somehow they've reconciled plastic surgery
Right.
into that.
Right. Well, when you read like different articles, whether it's newspaper, magazine articles, more academic literature about this, I think sometimes like our initial gut reaction to talking about plastic surgery is like, oh, you're so vain, right? But in a lot of cases, it's really not. Like a lot of times, these things like really can make a huge difference in someone's life in a real substantive way. And I think the ethical considerations that plastic surgeons deal with are important things for them to think about. But it's not always so clear cut and so black and white. And I think a lot of times they're really doing very good, important work for people. And sometimes it's psychological issues, like that definitely comes up also in the discussion. Sometimes it might not be a physical issue, but it might psychologically cause them issues. And my husband's almost finished training to be a psychologist, and he's writing his dissertation about body dysmorphic disorder, which is like when you have a distorted, like a certain thing in your body, like you have a distorted view of it, and he has some patients who've actually gotten plastic surgery. It doesn't help them because the whole thing is distorted to begin with, and he and I always talk about, like, should the plastic surgeon have done that surgery to begin with, like, when really the problem was psychological. But sometimes if it's psychologically, like, it could help, right, depending on, like, what the issue is. So I think that these are always important questions to think through and consider. Just to finish up here, so Rabbi Jachter, who also is a rabbi in Teaneck, of Sephardi Shul and at TABC, who has these books on contemporary halacha, Gray Matter, so this is volume 3. So he says in his discussion of this that he's actually not as sure. Right, Rabbi Blake presents it as like Rabbi Moshe's heter is a sweeping heter, and Rabbi Jachter says it's not so clear how far we can take Rabbi Moshe and how to apply it. Right? He says it's difficult to determine how far Rabbi Moshe would extend his permissive ruling. Does this tshuva constitute a sweeping endorsement of the propriety of cosmetic surgery, provided that it benefits the patient, which presumably it's going to if the patient is given consent to do it, and has his or her consent, which is how Rabbi Blake seems to present it? Or does Rav Moshe's lenient ruling apply only in a situation in which the surgery is of great need, such as in the specific case he adjudicated, which was the case of a shidduch issue, let's say?
What's he basing that on? Because we just read it and we don't see that at all.
Well, first of all, I didn't give you, I cut like bits and pieces out of the tshuva, and I'm happy to send you the whole tshuva if you want.
Okay.
But I think you're right, like even having read the whole tshuva, he doesn't really seem to like come back to that shidduch point, but still like the case that though he doesn't like come back to bring that up, still like that was the case that he was answering about. So maybe he would say that,
It was a specific answer to a specific question.
like,
Period.
even if you could apply this more broadly, like it would have to be a case of that, that also has great need. But then again, how do you define that? Like for me, like what's just like convenience, but like not such a big deal. For you, it might be great need. Like how do you define that is sometimes very subjective. So I want to conclude this shiur where we see, I think, like Rav Moshe being very sensitive to like people's emotions and human sensitivity and like to like societal needs, with just a short quote from a hesped that Rav Aaron Lichtenstein gave for Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, where he kind of highlights this as part of Rav Moshe Feinstein's methodology. So first he's talking about Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, and he says the basic idea behind his answer is that this prohibition is not measured in specifics, whether right now you remove this or that non-kosher food, etc., but rather in a larger perspective and a longer term. What will the ramifications be? So he's saying about Rav Shlomo Zalman that...
Hi everybody, it's Mechanecha Thursday. Listen up for where to go. Freshmen, NPR. Seniors, Beit Knesset. Mrs. Dr. Cohen's group, no Mechanecha for you today. And Mrs. Lerner's group, you're going to be in room 217. I'm going to say it all again. Freshmen, NPR.
Okay, I'm just going to
Seniors, Beit Knesset.
So he's right.
Dr. Cohen's group,
was saying
not
that Shlomo
meeting.
Zalman was very much about like seeing the bigger picture of what the ramifications of
Everybody
this
has
answer were going to
Mechanecha
be.
and
And that this
enjoy.
had enormous significance both on the interpersonal plane and in the public sphere. And he knew and wrote that the Chazon Ish differed with this view, and despite that he maintained his opinion. That's what he says about Rosh Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. And then he says, there was another posek in our generation who was comparable to him, to Rosh Shlomo Zalman, and also wrote several works, Rav Moshe Feinstein. He too related to the point of contact between the world of halacha and the world of human concerns, and combined total commitment to halacha with a commitment no less complete to the human element and human needs. And I think that Rav Wilkenstein, in his articulate way, really beautifully epitomizes so much of what Moshe's Tshuvos were all about, was really the sensitivity to human beings and human nature, along with commitment to halacha. But he was often interpreting the halacha in a sort of creative way. Not that takes away from his fidelity to tradition, but really to be able to be sensitive to the society around him. And God willing, we'll see that again next week. And next week I also want to share with you an interview with Moshe's son-in-law, where I think that also kind of highlights this point, which I thought was very interesting. And that will sort of kind of summarize all of our learning. So thank you so much. And we'll see many of you again.
Every Thursday, and then.
Well, it's for medical need, though. That really is for you. I mean, I'm sure that
Thank you.
Okay, good to see you.
Good to see you. Good job.
Oh, it's so nice. Totally self-contained.
Oh, yeah, good one?
No, I'm just doing my bookshelf, not all of it.
Thank you. But you
Thank you, everybody. Have a good Shabbos.
This is the work of the
Every Wednesday, 12:30.
Okay.